Thank you all for joining our third installment of Athletes as Leaders webinar series. My name is Jasenia Gorbea. I am the Community Manager for Coaching Boys into Men, and Futures Without Violence will be hosting Athletes as Leaders, and Rebecca will take it away from here.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for being here today and joining us for the third and final webinar of the series. In today's webinar, what we're going to do is we're going to deepen the learning around Athletes as Leaders, around the program, and cover some advanced topics. So today you're going to learn more about how you can train coaches, including those who may not be directly involved in facilitating the program with the athletes. You're also going to learn how to kind of coach the coaches and reinforce some of the key concepts from the program, such as modeling good boundaries and how to handle disclosures of abuse. And then the second part is going to be covering evaluation. So we're going to look at some of the program's implementation and evaluation outcomes. And we're going to also see what tools we have available for you to use in your community. And then lastly, we're going to switch gears and talk about kind of expanding your prevention efforts above and beyond and learn about kind of the policy level, what you can do to help implement or help guide communities in strengthening their policies for both schools and sports organizations to help prevent sexual assault and promote gender equity. So we're not going to be covering a lot of the program principles and content and structure that was covered in webinar 1, and we do recommend watching that one first before going into these advanced topics. And again, thank you for being here. So my name is Rebecca Milliman, and I'm the Prevention and Education Coordinator at the Harborview Center for Sexual Assault and Traumatic Stress, which is a long name. We are a local program here in Seattle serving survivors of sexual assault as well as other crime victims. And I'm one of the authors of the Athletes as Leaders program. You all met Jatia on the last webinar, who's a co-author with me, and I manage a comprehensive sexual assault project here in Seattle, mostly focused on one particular high school, and I'm actually not recording from there today, so hopefully you will not hear any bells in the background. And we do receive funding from rape prevention education dollars from the CDC, who's supporting this project. And then Lisa, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce yourself.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Ripper, and I am from the University of Pittsburgh and Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm a senior research coordinator in the Division of Adolescent and Young Adult Medicine, and my research team focuses on violence prevention programming for teens and young adults. I am very familiar with the evaluations of the Coaching Boys into Men program, and am helping my colleague, Summer Miller-Wallfish, with the evaluation for Athletes as Leaders.
Thanks, Lisa. And a few other announcements before we get started. We are going to ask you to hold questions until the end of each section. We do have these 3 distinct topics on today's webinar, so we will pause after each of the 3 sections and ask for questions. Otherwise, it's a little hard to track in the chat box, so if I miss a question, feel free to type it in again when we get to that point. And also, Jasenia already directed you to the web links and files, so everything we're referring today will be located in the web links box. And if you want a copy of the PowerPoint yourself to follow along, that is in the files box. So I'm just going to briefly describe the program again, and as most of you probably know, this program is all about developing student athletes as leaders. It's a program that encourages them to create a safe and supportive team and also beyond their team at their school and in their community. We based the content from research and best practices in the field of sexual assault prevention, and what we're really trying to do, as you know, is really avoid some of those traditional messages that are aimed at girls that tend to be victim-focused and ultimately sometimes victim blaming. So what we're instead trying to focus on is what do girls contribute to, how do they contribute to rape culture, and how can we empower them to be part of the solution, and really thinking about some of the more nuanced forms of sexual assault and harassment that maybe they do perpetuate and how they can help prevent them. So what we're talking about is, for example, slut shaming, body shaming, the girl-on-girl hate, rumor spreading, victim blaming, and then just reinforcing those negative stereotypes about both boys and girls. So we do recommend that this is a complement to other programs that intentionally engage men and boys. We obviously endorse the Coaching Boys into Men program, and that's what we use with our boys teams here locally. And as you know, it would be an issue if we're only targeting girls. So if you're in an all gender setting, you do want to make sure that you have efforts to engage all genders. And again, if you're in a girls-only organization or school, then it would be fine to just use this program as a standalone. Our program is available for free online at athletesasleaders.org, and if you haven't, you can sign up on our mailing list to never miss an update. And so a lot of the things we'll be referring today will be on the subpages of this website. At the top, you see, for example, the advocates page, the teams page, and we'll be referring to those today. Okay, so the first thing I have for you is a question that I'm hoping you can answer by typing into the chat box. And I want to hear from you about your thoughts on this question. What role can coaches play in violence prevention? So for those of you who are doing specific programming, you can talk about what you're doing in your specific programming, but you can also talk kind of from a more macro perspective, holistically. How do you see them as part of the solution in preventing violence? Excellent. I see by abstaining from victim-blaming language. That is key. What else? Someone said by being a mentor. Absolutely. Coaches should be empowering students to expect respect in all relationships. Love that. Calling out negative behaviors, being a positive role model. Encouraging communication when there is conflict. And sports is such a great venue to practice some of those skills. Being willing to listen. So many athletes look up to their coaches, and they really need good examples. Someone said educating themselves about the subject. Avoiding their prior behavior of enforcing gender norms. Reminding team members about the respectful role they hold. These are great. Any other thoughts? For male coaches of female teams, showing how men should behave. And I would say on boys teams too, that's important. Relationship level of the social ecological model, setting norms for the team for respect and language. Awesome. I love how you included the social ecological model. All right, excellent. Thank you. If you have other thoughts, feel free to continue to type them, and I'm going to move on to the next slide here. Okay, so just a quick review of the three roles, and these are the three terms that we use. So the advocate is the person who is the content expert. Usually this is a person who works at an SA or a DV program, and I should clarify, sexual assault or domestic violence program. Maybe they're in a prevention role like me. Maybe they are doing more direct services with survivors. Maybe it is a parent or a school counselor. It doesn't always have to be someone who works at a local program. It could be someone who works within the school who does have advanced knowledge on this topic and maybe has some capacity to kind of help coordinate the program overall. The next role is the mentor, and last webinar too was focused on the mentors train the trainer. The mentors are the ones who are actually facilitating the program. And then lastly, the coach. So the coach is that team administrator who we're hoping will reinforce the messages of the program throughout the season and will be our connection with parents. And the model that I'm going to introduce to you today is the model where the advocate is going to be prepping and training the coach. So meeting with them probably during preseason, recruiting them to join the movement, to get involved and commit to doing this program with their team, and then giving them the critical information that they need to know, what the program's all about and what their athletes will be involved in, but also how they can reinforce some of those key messages and key concepts from the program. So this is kind of a new model that I'm going to introduce today with some new tools that we recently created. And just as a reminder, with the mentor, we do recommend that this person is female identified or non-binary or gender creative. And the reason why is because we are discussing some really sensitive topics, and we do recommend that it is someone who has a really deep understanding of internalized sexism and the experience of being socialized in our culture as a woman or as a girl. And so because of the nature of the program, that's what we recommend for the mentor. What I've learned here, and I'm assuming in a lot of your communities, that a lot of our girls' teams are coached by men. And so what we want to think about is, if that is the situation on your team, what role does the male-identified coach have? If it's a female-identified coach or a non-binary person or gender-creative person who's the coach, then maybe they'll end up being the mentor. The coach and the mentor can often be the same person, right? Or the advocate and the mentor, like myself. I'm an advocate, but I also mentor teams myself directly. But sometimes it's three different people. And the coach, particularly when they're not going to be directly involved, like sitting in the sessions and helping to facilitate, we want to make sure that he still has a key role in supporting the concepts of the program and setting that, helping to guide that team culture toward what we're working for. So, well, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the coach's role specifically. And again, sometimes they are the mentor, but sometimes they're not the mentor. And so some of this information that I'm going to present will be more applicable depending on what their role is with the program. Okay, so all of this, a lot of what I'm talking about can be located on our Teams page. So at the top of our webpage, there's a Teams tab, and you'll see there's a coach section and an athlete section. And this is specifically what we are asking of coaches. So first of all, we are asking them, when we meet with them in the preseason, sometimes I go to a preseason coaches meeting if the athletic director will invite you to a meeting like that, or sometimes even before the school year starts, they have like an all-day coach retreat. If you can get on that agenda, that would be great, and present the program, what it's all about, and ask who's interested, and try to elicit some commitment from a coach, any coach of a girls' team, or maybe all of the coaches. And that's been our goal at our local high school, is to ultimately have every team participate in either Athletes as Leaders or Coaching Boys into Men. Next, we really ask them that it doesn't just stop with that initial commitment and setting the schedule. We do want them to communicate throughout the season with the athletes about the program, as well as with parents potentially and with us. And then lastly, we are asking them to reinforce the messages of the program, and I'm going to go through that in great detail next. So the coach's task for the preseason, we have a new document that you might not have seen yet. I just uploaded it to our website, I think on Friday, and it's called the preseason planning form. And so it is going to be on the Advocates page, the Advocates Toolkit, and you'll see a button at the bottom that directly links you to the preseason planning form. And this is all outlined on that form. So you're going to be going over this usually in person with the coach when you meet with them preseason. So this is what we're asking of them specifically. We want them to meet with you, either the mentor or the advocate, to discuss who will help run the program. We want them to help us get to know their team and their sport. I think I told you before, when I mentored the wrestling team, I didn't know anything about wrestling. I had never been to a wrestling match. I had never, learned anything about the rules or what it even looks like. And so the coaches kind of gave me a Wrestling 101 tutorial, which was actually really helpful. And then I was able to attend some of their competitions and practices to kind of learn more about it. This program also relies on full team attendance because, as you've learned in the earlier webinars, it's really a social norms program, and so it really relies on full team attendance. So we recommend that the coaches make it the expectation for all the athletes to attend, and ideally holding those group sessions during practice time, so again, it sets the tone that this is expected or maybe even required. We also ask the coach to send home a parent letter with the information about the program to the teams, and there is a sample parent letter on our website. Again, at the Advocate Toolkit, you'll find that sample parent letter that you can adapt. And then you want to also maybe consider if there is a parent night or a preseason meeting, try to get on that agenda, see if the coach can include you in that. And then to complete the season planning form. And again, that's on our website on the Advocates Toolkit. And here's kind of what it looks like. So we're asking coaches to fill out all this information about their contact information, when they practice, how it's best to contact them. And then usually what I ask them to do is give me your first choice, your second choice, and your third choice. Hopefully you'll get your first choice of the day and time that you want us to run the groups. Again, this is if myself or an outside person is coming in to mentor the team. If it's the coach who's actually mentoring the team themselves and facilitating, this is kind of a moot point and not as important. But for me to try to collaborate and coordinate, because I have a team of folks, mostly myself and my interns, my awesome interns who help me, we want to make sure that we try to get them the choice of time that works for them, but also we have to look at our own availability. That's why I asked them for their top 3 choices. You really want to get a good idea of when the season starts and ends, too, because I swear every time we do this, the end of the season really sneaks up on me, and you don't realize sometimes if they don't make it in the playoffs that the season can actually end pretty quickly. I even worked with one team that only had a 6-week season, and that was really challenging, which was golf. And so the coach luckily agreed to allow us to meet for 40 minutes instead of 20 minutes, and we did 2 sessions in each meeting. Okay, so let's talk about the coach involvement during implementation. So again, I just described earlier who we recommend as the facilitators, and so the question will often come up, well, should the coach be in the room? And this is really an explicit conversation that you should have with the coach, and usually what I tell the coaches when I'm meeting with them in advance is, sometimes the athletes might feel more comfortable because we are talking about such sensitive topics. If the space, is reserved for the team and the mentor, but I've never had a coach demand that they want to be in the room, for example. But we have had some of the coaches I work with are fine with just not being that involved. I still ask them to stay on site just in case of an emergency, but usually they're hanging out around outside the room that we're in, like cleaning up equipment or getting things set up. But sometimes we've actually asked the athletes, hey, do you want your coach involved in this program? Do you want them to be sitting here in the groups? And we have had at least one team here who really did want their coach, and this was a male-identified coach who did want him in the room. And they felt like this was going to help him get to know them on a much deeper level. And so I also had to kind of talk, that's actually happened with 2 teams here. So we did have to talk about making sure that the athletes are really guiding the conversation and that it's completely dominated by young people's voices. But if it's okay with them and they want them to be there, then you can kind of play that by ear based on the community's needs. Okay, so during the season, we want to ensure that the athletes come to the groups. And so I really ask coaches, please, can you send weekly reminders. As you probably know, those of you who do work with adolescents, well, and even adults, I mean, all of us love a reminder, right? We have a calendar, but it's always nice to get those last-minute reminders. So I do ask coaches, ideally, to text if they have like a group chat, or if they have a team captain, like sometimes the coach would not be on that, but if they have a team captain that can remind everybody about the group, or email the group and send them that last-minute reminder. I usually don't have direct contact information for the athletes, and so I kind of rely on the coach to do that last-minute reminder either day of or day before. We also want the coaches to always communicate with us for any reported schedule changes. I just had the softball coach today let me know that one of their games has been rescheduled, and that lets me know if we need to reschedule one of our groups. And then we want them to reinforce the key concepts of the program. And so that's going to be the main content that you want to train the coaches on. And we have this new document that we just published last week on our website called Information for Coaches. And you will find this on both the advocate page as well as the teams page. And here's what it looks like. So it's just a 2-pager. It's a front and back PDF that you can print and go over with the coach when you meet with them pre-season. And the nice thing about this is that, you know, I'm calling it a training, but really what it is just kind of an informal meeting, because oftentimes it will be just an advocate and one coach sitting down together. Sometimes it might be a small group of coaches. But in general, especially if the coach is not directly involved in facilitation, there's no need for them to, well, I mean, ideally we would have more time with them, but we're not going to often be able to get them in for a 2-hour training, for example. So I'm envisioning like a 30 to 60-minute meeting where you sit down with them. I just recently met with a coach one-on-one who's starting up the program, and I went over what the program's all about, what the goals of the program are, what the topics, the 10 topics that we cover, and then the structure, how it fits into the sports season, and specifically the time constraints that we have, or the time requirements that we have. And then on the back, it has these 4 categories of key concepts for the coach that we want them to reinforce with the athletes throughout the season. So this is kind of a key piece for them to help support the major lessons from the program. And so I'm going to go through, this is probably hard for you to read, so I'm going to go through each one now. So challenging gender stereotypes. And again, this is you sitting down with a coach and going over each one of these and having a little discussion around it, asking if they have any questions. But these are just kind of tips for coaches. So when it comes to challenging gender stereotypes, we want them to avoid terms that reinforce negative stereotypes, such as girl push-ups. That's very common. I still hear people say that. But girl push-ups is when people do push-ups on their knees. That implies that girls are weaker or can't do a regular push-up. And so you hear that a lot in sports culture. We want coaches to avoid terms like that. Same with run like a girl, man up, girls are so dramatic, you know, that kind of thing. We want coaches to praise athletes on their strengths, their character, their teamwork, effort, dedication, skill, level of improvement, and their accomplishments. That's really what we're also training athletes to do with each other. So we want coaches to model that. We want coaches to use gender-inclusive terms such as huddle up team or listen up Bulldogs, whatever the mascot is, or okay wrestlers, let's go, and try to avoid, hey ladies, right? Not everyone on a girl's team identifies as a lady or as a woman or as a girl. So we want to try to have them use gender-inclusive language for the whole team. And then lastly, we really want them to nurture a supportive team culture for girls and for non-binary athletes, regardless of how they choose to dress or how they choose to express themselves. So obviously the goal for our athletes is to feel welcome and included on the team, and I really want coaches, I want to explicitly say that to coaches to have them think about that. And then on the information for coaches handout, it does explain the term non-binary, just in case they're not familiar with that term, which means being outside of the binary, that kind of either or, male or female system that we tend to categorize people and put them in boxes. So non-binary identities can include expressions of masculinity, femininity, both, or neither. And the next category of tips we have is how coaches can model good boundaries with the athletes. So coaches obviously play a really key role in showing what appropriate boundaries look like and should look like with an adult and with someone in a position of power. We really want to try to have them avoid comments about athletes' physical appearance. And what I notice, and I've been guilty of this myself, is we tend to comment on the physical appearance more often of girls than boys, and we want to try to avoid that altogether. Unless it's maybe, related to their performance or their uniform standards, but other than that, we want to be focusing more on their accomplishments and looking deeper, right? We also want to have them model consent. So beyond a high five, coaches should really be asking for consent, like, for example, is it okay if I move your arms to correct your position? Modeling that is huge, right? Then the athlete's kind of learning, oh, this is what consent looks like, and my coach is asking me before he touches me or before she touches me. Giving everyone the same level of support and attention is really important for coaches, not to be giving special attention to certain athletes. Also, they should really think about the contact that they have with athletes outside the program. It should only happen as it's necessary and related to the sport. They should not be kind of communicating about personal things with athletes. Also, avoiding one-on-one contact and giving special privileges to certain athletes is something to be avoided. And then lastly, really communicating with those parents and having an open door policy. So I have heard of these situations where coaches lock their practices, lock the doors, and they have their kind of special thing with the athletes and don't allow the parents in. I do not recommend that. I think coaches should always have an open door policy. It again, models good boundaries and shows that they're doing nothing in secrecy, and they're always open to having more monitoring and supervision. Okay, next, promoting gender equity. What can we ask of coaches? We really want them to try to advocate for the girls' teams. We want the girls' teams to get the same level of recognition, like at the school assemblies and in the daily announcements. We want the girls' teams to get the same resources, like how they run their fundraisers and what kind of facilities they get to use as the boys' teams. We also want them to speak up about unfair practices or rules that put a certain group of athletes at a disadvantage, or that maybe even exclude athletes, such as girls or non-binary youth, low-income students, youth of color, etc. We also want them to encourage the leadership of girls and non-binary student athletes, and that's, again, a big tenet of the program with the athletes. So we're teaching the athletes that. We want coaches to support that. We want them to really think about if they have control over hiring, promoting, and advocating for a more diverse coaching staff. And then lastly, they need to educate themselves about Title IX and how they can prevent gender discrimination. The last category is supporting survivors. So we want coaches to be prepared, just in case. They might have an athlete report that they've experienced some type of abuse or trauma or been victimized in some sort of way. We want coaches to be prepared for that. And so what I tell them is, just being a good listener is probably the most important thing. Someone mentioned that earlier on the chat. Listening to them, believing them, thanking them for telling you, letting them know that you're there to support them. We also want coaches to be aware of some community resources, and sometimes I just give them, the information for my local program here, but also making sure that they know who the school counselor is and where they're located and any maybe local hotlines that you have. And then we also want them to make sure that they know what the reporting requirements are for the school or for the organization. In some states, coaches might be a mandated reporter. In some states, coaches might not be considered a mandated reporter. So we just want to make sure that they kind of know what the mandate is, and not just the laws, but also the internal policies. And then lastly, sports and exercise can provide stress relief and a regular return to regular routine, which we know is, both of which are recommended for trauma survivors. So we want to talk to the coaches about that too, like if they do have survivors on their team, which they always will. Being involved with sports is actually a really, really good thing. And if someone's experienced a traumatic event, it actually is recommended to return to the regular routine and activities as soon as they can. So we talk about that. Before I move on, I want to pause here and see if there's any questions so far about training coaches. If so, feel free to type into the chat. Okay, someone asked, having experienced teams with players who were extremely hurtful to other players, how do you deal with that if you find out a team has such a person? That is a great question, and I'm going to answer it a little bit here, but then it's also really going to be addressed later in this webinar too when we talk about recommended policies. But this is something that is really good to know up front. If sometimes when I meet with the coach during the preseason, right before we start the program, I do ask them, what is the team dynamic like? Have you had any concerns or incidents? Because it's always better to be aware of the dynamic, and if there have been any incidents that involve, violence or harassment or bullying. And sometimes the coaches will actually come to you for advice on how to handle that. So I think it's good to be aware of that up front if they're willing to share that to you. Otherwise, when I'm facilitating the program, once in a while I'll kind of pick up on the dynamics of the team, or athletes will maybe disclose, that there's something going on with the team. But I think in general it's good to problem solve with the coach of how that should be handled, and how that coach can not only model that kind of positive behavior that they want to see, but also really directly address it when it does come up. We don't want coaches kind of ignore when they see these incidences occurring of one athlete targeting another, and so giving coaches the tools that they need to kind of be, those basic bystander intervention guidelines and recommendations. And I also love Coaching Boys into Men has all the tips on teachable moments, and sometimes I use some of that information too when I'm training the coaches about stopping, educating them what you heard and why it's wrong, and then kind of going on the defense to describe why it's hurtful or how that could affect the person, and then go on the offense, which means like teaching them what you want to see in the future, what you want to see from them. And that can be done individually with the problematic athlete, or it could be done in a group setting depending on what the coach thinks is best. Okay, someone said that they do notice that coaches tend to have closed-door practices because the parents come in and yell at their child and undermine the coach, and I totally get that too. This is the thing, is when we recommend one thing, sometimes there's another reason from another perspective of doing it another way. When I say I recommend open-door policies, same with teachers. We want the doors to be unlocked. We want we want the windows to be visible. We want someone that's walking by to be able to see and hear what's going on. But then sometimes people might feel like that undermines what they're doing, and it doesn't allow any privacy. Where I'm coming from is really from a sexual assault prevention standpoint. So I'm all about keeping areas visible and open doors. I think the perception that a coach, we actually had a local case here several years ago with a coach who ultimately turned out he was abusing multiple athletes on the team sexually, and he would have these closed-door practices and was really shutting out the parents, not allowing them to be involved really on any level, and would kind of have his inner circle and his outer circle with just the athletes. And of course, this later comes out that abuse was occurring and that this was part of the grooming process. So from my perspective, I always kind of recommend high visibility and open doors, but I can also understand a coach not wanting parents to come in and scream at their kids. So again, that can just be a discussion that you have. Someone said any advice working with less engaged coaches? Oh, that's a great question. So, you know, I think we told you on an earlier webinar that my advice is really always to start small. The way we did it here locally was we kind of started really big from the beginning, and it's not a great way to learn kind of what it takes to be successful. I think it's better to start with one team and see what it takes to make it successful. And I would start with more of a motivated coach who's really bought in from the beginning, and most likely there is going to be a coach like that. And then maybe have that coach help start the movement, spread the word, elicit buy-in from other stakeholders. Sometimes you can also get the athletic director on board. You might have heard from our athletic director here at the local high school on webinar 1, and she was recommending that sometimes you really have to have buy-in from the top. And for example, if the principal or the athletic director is telling the coaches that this is something they really want them to do, that can be another way to, get them on board. But what I try to do is really just try to be enthusiastic, as enthusiastic as I can, to get them to want to be involved. And I really do think, for me at least, I haven't had, sometimes I'm worried that people won't want to do it and won't want to get involved. But I think especially with all the recent media around sexual assault, there's this higher level of awareness, and coaches, a lot of them want to do something and aren't really sure what to do. And so this is something that is relatively easy. We're talking about just 20 minutes once a week. It's not a huge level of commitment, but I talk about, and most coaches would agree, it's not all about the sport and developing these stellar athletes that are going to go on and dominate in their sport. It's also about character development and mentoring them to be awesome human beings that will contribute to the world, right? So I come at it from that angle too. And sometimes I do share, statistics, and we talk about concerns that have happened previously in the community. So there's lots of different engagement strategies, and I'm happy to talk further if you want to reach out to me directly. Okay, so someone asked, how do I start by approaching the coaches or the school admin? What I do is I first build a relationship and contact the athletic director, and then see if the athletic director is willing to connect me with coaches. And I've done that two ways. One, the athletic director invites me to what they call the pre-season coaches meeting, and she gives me 5 minutes on the agenda. I briefly introduce the program and show the short video that's on our website, and I just send around a clipboard and ask, who's interested in getting involved? Give me your direct contact information, and then I collect the clipboard and get in touch with them directly. Sometimes now that we're a few years into the project, the coach will, because so many of the coaches already are doing the program and already engaged, we just have now the athletic director just gives me the direct contact information for the few coaches that are new, and then sometimes she'll do a direct email introduction introducing me with the coach, and then I take it from there. Okay, great. I think we need to move on for the sake of time. Sorry, I see a couple other questions that I didn't have a chance to answer, but for the sake of time, I want to move on to the evaluation component, and then if there's additional time at the end, I want to come back to some of these other questions. So if you could remember them and remind me later at the end, or contact me directly after, I want to make sure that I them. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Lisa, who's going to be talking about evaluation.
Thanks, Rebecca. So I am going to talk about the evaluation of this program. So we're evaluating athletes as leaders to determine the effectiveness of the program. This is just to make sure that we're on the right track and that the program is meeting its intended goals and outcomes. That way, if it's not, we can make changes to the curriculum and make it better to make sure that we're hitting those goals and outcomes. We're also trying to build an evidence base. Oh, sorry, I'm getting some comments that it's very hard to hear me. Sorry about that, everyone.
Lisa, why don't you
Yes.
go ahead and test it one more time? Just come closer
Okay.
to the phone.
Yes, sure. Sorry, everyone. Thanks for your patience.
All right.
Is this a little bit better?
Yeah, that's a little better. Just
Okay.
speak a little more loudly, and I think we'll be okay.
Okay, great. So we were talking about building an evidence base. This will help us to inform future programming and expansion of the program. This is a screenshot of the evaluation tool on the website. And some things that I would like to point out to you, that if you are interested in being a pilot site for the spring, we're asking that athletes take 2 surveys. The first is the pre-survey, which you will, the athletes will fill out before session 1. And then the second survey is the post-survey. This survey will be done after session 10. We want teams to complete all of the sessions, all 10 sessions, but if a team can't for some reason, we still want them to take the post-test. You'll also see that there's a weekly implementation report, which is also required for pilot sites. The mentor or advocate should fill this out after every session. It's just a form that provides general feedback about the session, the curriculum, and the facilitation. And again, this can be found on the website under evaluation tools. Please contact us if you're interested in piloting. Right now, we are hoping to get a few more teams for spring. Just a little plug for you. So if your team is interested, if you have a team that's interested in participating in the pilot, please only complete the tools, so the survey, pre and post, and the weekly implementation report with high school athletes, and then send to the evaluation team. Other teams, all other teams are welcome to complete the tools with other age groups for your own records, but please do not send those to the evaluation team. We're just looking at high school teams right now. All right. So next we have some results from the pilot project, but before we do that, I think Rebecca wants to highlight a few teams that have been participating in the program. Rebecca?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to specifically acknowledge and recognize and thank the pilot sites who have participated in this year's evaluation thus far. So in Seattle here at Garfield, we had both the cheer team, JV and JVC girls basketball team. In Grand Forks, North Dakota, we had the Central High School volleyball team. Jackson, Wyoming, the Jackson Hole High School swimming team. In Cathlamet here in Washington, we had Wahkiakum High School basketball team. And then in Seattle again, Holy Names Academy basketball. In Berryville, Arkansas, we had the Berryville High School cheer team. I know some of you are on the call today, so thank you again. Actually, the picture here is from Grand Forks, North Dakota, the Red River High School and Central High School hockey team, which I was so excited about because we do not have hockey here as a high school sport. So I was thrilled that we had a hockey team. And then in Hayes, Kansas, we had the Hayes High School basketball team. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, we had the Westinghouse High School basketball team. And then lastly, in Duchesne, Utah, we had the Uintah River High School girls basketball team. So thank you, and I'll hand it back over to you, Lisa.
Awesome. It's been really great to hear about all the teams across the country that are participating in this program. So I want to share with you some results from the surveys. But a couple of things about these surveys, that these questions that you're going to see on the screen and then the next couple of slides after are questions that have been validated and tested and have been used in other surveys before. We know that these are good questions to ask athletes in this age group. So that's why we are picking these questions. We're asking these questions to improve content of the program, and then also to collect information and data to potentially expand this program, gain support from future partners, and hopefully do some more rigorous testing and research on this program. So the first slide is the percentage of participants who answered very abusive or extremely abusive to questions about the severity of abusive behaviors in a relationship. This is from fall 2017 and winter 2017, and this is just examples of some of the questions that were asked in the surveys. And you can see that there is a pretty big jump for some of them between pre and post. Yeah. And thank you, Rebecca, for pointing out that the results that you're seeing in these slides are from pre and post surveys that have been returned thus far. Some of our winter teams are still going, and those results will be included in the future. Our next slide is the percentage of participants who answered agree or strongly agreed to questions about intervening when they don't agree with someone. And next, the percentage of participants who answered agree or strongly agree in response to questions about their team. Another thing that I just want to point out is that we are not matching surveys, pre and post surveys right now. So these surveys are anonymous. We don't know who they belong to. And we're not collecting any demographic information right now. So it's just very general information, again, to start building that evidence base for the program. Percentage of participants who answered agree or strongly agreed when asked questions about gender. And this one, percentage of athletes who answered agree or strongly agree when asked questions about how they see themselves. Yeah. And before we get into athlete responses, I just want to put another plug out there that we are accepting pilot teams for the spring. So if you are interested in that, please let us know. There is a question. What does this data tell us about the program? So many of these questions are based off of existing validated measures that are linked to root causes of sexual assault. And there's a question about measuring responses that improves from disagree to somewhat agree. That is a part of the service, but for the purposes of this webinar, we're just showing you the agree, strongly agree, but that is something that we can provide to schools. So if schools want data about their teams, we can provide that de-identified data, which will give you the whole picture of everything. There was a question about if we had any theories as to why some of the data went down after the program. And we think that, Rebecca thinks that it is because of the small sample size. It's actually just a difference of 1 or 2 athletes, which is why you might see a lower response. For example, the percentage of participants who answered agree or strongly agree in response to questions about their team. The example there was my teammates support me and other girls by giving compliments rather than talking negatively. That's an example where we see in the post-test it went down just 2 percentage points. And again, that could just be the difference between 1 or 2 people. Small sample sizes. Are there any questions, any other questions about data that we can answer now?
And this is Rebecca, and I just saw Kirsten's comment, and I was kind of thinking the same thing as well. It is kind of interesting when you ask questions, for example, about how supportive the team is. And when you think about the pre-survey, you're often asking this before the teams really started because sometimes we're asking this during preseason where especially new athletes don't even really know their teammates. And then, like you said, the season goes on, and then they learn more about specifically what this actually looks like. So maybe they're more aware of what we're even asking. But also maybe if there have been issues or there has been quote-unquote drama or any kind of conflict between athletes, that's more likely to come up, during the season. So at postseason, they would have recognized that. So I think that's another thing that throws it off. Lisa, do you want to answer the question about do you think students have trouble distinguishing between very abusive, extremely abusive? I don't know if you know that with athletes, but I know with coaching boys and men, you might be familiar with the results.
Yes. So that is a great question. I think you always run into that students might have some trouble distinguishing between that. For coaching boys into men, we did a middle school study, and we actually had questions about what does abusive mean. Again, this was with middle schoolers, so we had to elaborate that, provide a definition that would be like something abusive is something that is considered harmful or hurtful to other people. We also described Likert scales if people had questions as, for example, not using this very abusive and extremely abusive example as something that is like definitely or not at all. So if something was if you were very or extremely likely, I guess that would be the best way to describe that. So extremely likely was yes, definitely, versus not at all likely was like no way. I think that helped our middle schoolers understand the Likert scale a little bit. We don't want to be biased and answer the questions for the athletes. So if they ask us for help in interpreting this, then we can help them figure it out. But we don't want to bias them towards one way or the other. Rebecca, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Not at this point.
So the question is the goal to get students to identify abusive behaviors or be able to put them on a scale of how abusive something is? It's to get them to identify behaviors. Yes, like what do you consider this to be abusive or not? We're going to move on. So if you have any further questions about evaluation data stuff, please hold them to the end, and we will get to you to your questions then. I want to talk about athlete responses. So we had asked athletes, what was the most important thing that you gained from the program? I really like this girl positivity comment, and the one at the bottom, we often don't know what others are going through. Never jump to conclusions about people. So I'll give you a few minutes to read the slide. And the next slide. How has the program changed your team as a whole? We asked this question to athletes, and a lot of participants have said that we're engaged in each other's lives. We're not just teammates, but we're also a family. And it seems like the girls are more comfortable around each other and really talking about what's going on in their lives. Great. So we kind of jumped the gun a little bit on questions. So we're going to go ahead towards recommended prevention policies. Again, if you have questions related to the evaluation, we can try to answer them at the end of the webinar, and you can certainly reach out to Rebecca and Summer or myself with any additional data questions. So I'm going to hand you back to Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So I'm going to transition now into our final section, which is about recommended prevention policies. So every school or athletics organization should definitely have some policies, some internal policies that govern the operations and the conduct of its members. These should really reflect the values and priorities of the organization. When you have specific policies that are related to preventing sexual assault and abuse, as well as promoting gender equity, it does demonstrate a commitment to creating a safe and fair environment for all athletes. I think it also provides a lot of reassurance for folks who are working there, as well as parents and athletes themselves, that this organization cares about this issue and is being proactive about it. And so what we're going to talk about now is based on our recommended policy document, which you can find, again, on the Advocates page. So I would like to ask you all a question first. Why do you think sports are a place where children are particularly vulnerable to sexual abuse? And you can answer by typing into the chat. Athletes are frequently alone with coaches or trainers. Also, because of that natural power dynamic between the athlete and the coaches have a lot of power and privilege in our culture. Athletes often look up to and idealize their coach, and also because of the power dynamics. Someone said toxic masculinity that is often tied up with the physical ability for males. Yes. A strong focus on bodily movements, the power dynamic between male sports and female sports might be easier to manipulate due to the trust that's built, makes it easier for grooming to occur. Wow, you are on point with all of these comments. Normalize opportunities for one-on-one coaching for quote-unquote elite athletes. Parents give a lot of power to the coaches. Children are naturally vulnerable, especially under mentors and power. Easier for perpetrators to hide, be supportive and powerful in the community? Yes. So I really appreciate your comments here, and I agree with everything you're saying. And someone earlier mentioned the social ecological model, which I love, and this is just part of it, right? We're working with athletes directly and coaches directly, but we also want to do something on a larger scale, a larger kind of the outer layers of the social ecological model, more of the organizational level and the policy level, to make sure that there are proactively policies in place. What I have found is sometimes organizations and schools and communities are more reactive. Like, it takes a terrible case to happen, an incident to occur for organizations to realize that this is something that can affect them and it can happen in their community, and then they want to create these policies, and a lot of times they're much more open to it. And so what I encourage you to do is talk with communities, particularly those smaller sports organizations that might not have any policies in this area, to think about it proactively. And of course, recently, again in the media, we've had these really high-profile cases. I think about Larry Nassar, who now, I believe, has been accused by 175 athletes of sexual misconduct and sexual assault occurring under the auspices of medical care. And I really encourage those of you to watch some of the athletes who testified in court giving a victim impact statement. And I also want folks to be prepared for the content, because it can be very difficult to watch. But what I really appreciated first of all, I appreciated all of their, courage in coming forward, and a lot of them really called for better policies and how this was allowed to continue over a period of years, and athletes who had come forward and reported it to various entities. And of course, this is a very high-profile case that seems very rare for it to go this far, but it's just something for all of us to be aware of, that this can occur, and we want to make sure that we are responding appropriately and being really proactive with having policies and protections in place. So I really encourage you to watch some of those videos on YouTube if you can of the athletes coming forward and testifying around the sentencing hearing with their victim impact statements. And what a lot of you said is correct. What the research shows is some of the reasons that sports make children particularly vulnerable to sexual abuse include that close nature of that athlete-coach relationship, like many of you said. Also, the high levels of trust that the parents do put in the coach, and in this previous case, the doctor, the team doctor, but also in the administrators. Parents really put a lot of trust in these adults who are often, highly esteemed in the community and well-loved. And there's a lot of pressure in sports to, have your child excel. And you trust that you're putting them in the hands of someone who, first and foremost, would protect them, right? And then lastly, sports, and particularly certain sports, really sometimes encourage secrecy and the endurance of pain. And many of the athletes in this sentencing hearing talked about that a lot, that was part of the issue, that they were encouraged to fight and compete and practice through injuries and ignore the pain and numb out, and that was a dangerous combination. So in our recommended policy document, we have 3 policy areas. The first is we want to make sure that schools and orgs have policies that protect children by preventing sexual misconduct and abuse by adults. But we also want to think about peer-on-peer sexual harassment and assault. And then lastly, we hope that orgs and schools can create policies that intentionally promote gender equity for staff and youth participants. Because as we know, some of the risk factors for sexual assault and gender-based violence do have to do with gender inequity and social norms that support gender inequity, male superiority, and female inferiority. So that's why we want to also include gender equity in our policy goals. So a lot of the information that I have on this next slide when we talk about preventing adult misconduct comes from the CDC document that it's several years old, but I still think it's one of the best policy guidelines out there from the CDC called Preventing Child Sexual Abuse Within Youth-Serving Organizations. And you can just Google that title and it will be the first thing to pop up, but you can also, there's a link to it in our policy document. And so the following are some policy recommendations that youth sports organizations can implement in order to prevent sexual misconduct and respond appropriately, like if they ever do get allegations. So first of all, you want to think about screening, and we want organizations and schools to kind of consider how they can help prevent adults who they are bringing in to work with children to prevent them, creating an environment where abuse is more likely to occur. So we want to make sure that they are screening, including background checks and extensive reference checks, incorporate that into the routine application procedure for not only staff, but also volunteers. This is really important. What I've learned from this project is so many coaches are volunteer. I was kind of surprised, actually, how many are not paid and come in to give back to the community. Sometimes they're parents on the team. Sometimes they're alumni, but we need to make sure that we're screening everyone and making sure that everyone's going through the proper background checks. And then we also want to consider running additional background checks, on a regular basis, annually. Sometimes you've had coaches that have been there 10, 15, 20 years. So how often are folks running background checks? That's important to consider, both for staff and for volunteers. We also want to make sure that applicants are really explicitly educated about how the organization values protecting children and educates them on what the policies are, and then literally ask them to sign off so you have documentation that they understand the policies. And then again, like I said before, fostering this open door policy where not just, between athletes and coaches, but also where coaches really have that open door policy to leadership where they can report if they do ever have concerns about a coworker, about one of their coaches or an administrator. We want to make sure that there's an open door policy to be able to question behavior. That just makes us all safer. And then next, we want to consider guidelines for conduct. So we want to have it really well established and written out what you expect of how the adults should be interacting with the minors. So, for example, limiting one-on-one interactions between youth and adults. Oftentimes, I've seen organizations have this rule of 3, where there's always 3 people present, for example, 2 youth and 1 adult, or 2 adults and 1 youth, but never just a one-on-one. If a coach is doing a one-on-one session with an athlete for a specific reason, it is better to request that a parent or another coach be present. And if it does take place, it's better if it's in a public space, an open space where others can observe, and that everyone is made aware that that is occurring. So again, the big problem is when a one-on-one interactions are occurring in secrecy, right? So if they do have to occur for whatever reason, some people were talking about this elite athletes getting individual coaching sessions, everyone should be aware that that's occurring. We also want to make sure that they always have maintain a current list of all the athletes and caregivers, and make sure that they know of any no contact orders, anyone that the youth should not have contact with out of safety. And then lastly, we want to make sure that the coaches understand that they need to model appropriate boundaries. So not developing relationships with youth outside of the program, not sharing too much personal information. I think this is important to explicitly talk to coaches about. Sometimes athletes get really close with their coaches and start asking a lot of personal information, and it's okay to tell an athlete, no, that's my personal information and I'm not going to share that, but it's okay that, that you're curious and asking me, but I'm going to refrain from answering, and I'm not going to ask you any personal questions either. We also want to, like I said, talk to them about touch and consent and how they can model that. And again, a lot of this is reflected in the Information for Coaches resource that I shared earlier. So like I said, the CDC document is great. Also, there's an organization called Safe for Athletes. Also, Safe Sport and Safe to Compete are all great organizations that have great resources and tools. And again, the links are all in our recommended policy document. Okay, so next I want to move on to how to prevent peer-on-peer sexual assault. So the team environment, as you know, it can be a really great place for athletes to practice skills that they can use and to have healthy relationships and to learn important lessons from caring adults such as coaches. So one thing that we recommend is to have a code of conduct for athletes. So this should really include how the athletes are expected to treat each other and other people outside of the team even. We want to foster a climate that promotes respect and equality and consent and safety, and we want to make sure that it also explicitly prohibits other behaviors such as hazing. Hazing can be a huge problem with sports teams. It's not just fraternities, it's sports teams where they initiate younger athletes who have just joined the team, and we want to make sure that there's explicit policies prohibiting that, as well as prohibiting sexual harassment, bullying, sexual assault, and then disciplinary action should be taken anytime the athlete, violates the code. Then we also want to make sure that the athletes are aware of this. You're not just handing them a binder or giving them a web link, but actually in a team meeting going over the code of conduct. Okay, next we want to make sure that coaches, not just athletes, but coaches are also trained to intervene when they do see an incident of harassment or bullying. And so in my trainings, I try to dig a little bit deeper and talk about the connections with homophobia and transphobia and sexism and sexual violence. And it's a good idea for the training to point out some of the specific phrases that are problematic and reinforce stereotypes like we discussed earlier. Then after being trained, we want the athletic staff to feel that responsibility, that it is their responsibility to intervene when they do see some kind of thing happening, like a serious conduct violation, such as harassment or bullying. And depending on the incident, this could be just simply saying something in the moment. That goes a long way. When adults just act like they didn't hear it or ignore it, it sets the tone that that's okay in that community. And what we want the adults to do is take leadership, as well as team members, athletes themselves, to speak up and make it clear that they saw what happened and it's not okay. So even just saying something. It could also include notifying other folks, like an athlete's caregiver if it's something serious, maybe checking in with the target or the victim in the situation and making sure that they're okay, specifically educating the aggressor and calling them in instead of calling them out, but calling them in to make it a learning opportunity so they understand the impact of their behavior, and then also seeking support if they're not sure how to handle the situation. This really does create a culture where this violent behavior is not normalized or tolerated, and that's our ultimate goal. And then lastly, we want to make sure that folks at the school or athletic organization know how to handle disclosures. And so we want to make sure that they are expected to be supportive if an athlete ever makes a disclosure and what they should do with that information. And again, there's some additional resources that are out there that are linked in our policy document. Okay, so what I want to ask you now is if you could give us an example of a statement that could be included in an athlete code of conduct. What do you think? So you can type into the chat box and give us any example of a statement that could be included in an athlete code of conduct. Even if you've never written a document like this, think about statements that you could do to encourage athletes to use, respectful behavior and also specifically prohibit problematic behavior. What do you all think? I see people typing. Treat others with respect. Love it. We choose safe ways. That means never aiming verbal or physical abuse at anyone. Verbal abuse is hurting people with your words. Physical abuse is hurting people with your body. I love how you spell it out like that. I will refrain from using derogatory or demeaning language. Excellent. And I like what Marcy said. It's worded in the first person, because you can envision this, maybe being something that the athletes go over and then maybe sign to show that they agree. So I like the idea of framing it in the first person. Someone said they're currently a college soccer player. That's awesome. And they have something similar in a conduct book, specifically speaking about cyberbullying. That's great to include that. Being kind and respectful. I have the right to speak up when I see something going on. Excellent. Great. Thank you so much for all of your ideas. And you can continue to type. Meanwhile, I'm going to move on for the sake of time. So the last category of policies that we recommend you explore are those that attempt to achieve gender equity. So as we know, sexual violence is a widespread issue and is a product of many cultural and societal factors. And some of those do have to do with gender inequity. And so policies related to gender equity are a really important component of a comprehensive strategy to prevent sexual violence. And these policies, furthermore, can also help organizations comply with legal mandates such as Title IX and also anti-discrimination laws. So we want to think about how the rules are enforced. So all athletes, regardless of gender, should be held in an equitable way to the standards of the Athlete Code of Conduct. So if they already have the Code of Conduct, they should review it regularly and get staff and athlete input and make sure that it's unbiased. They also want to keep accurate records of incidences and kind of look at how they're responding. We want to see if any particular group of athletes is more often disciplined or vice versa, if one more often receives lighter discipline. And I have seen this sometimes with athletes in general, that they're sometimes not held to the same standards, but regardless, we should make sure that everyone is held to the same standard and consequences and expectations, regardless of their gender, what sport they play, their race or ethnicity, their level of talent. We expect that the star of the football team, for example, with a scholarship to college, really should be held to the same standards as the athlete who never leaves the bench. Next, we want to examine dress code policies. If dress codes do exist, we want to make sure that they're not biased against girls and transgender athletes. We want to make sure that it's enforced equitably. So, for example, if the athlete's uniform makes them uncomfortable, we want to encourage coaches and administrators to allow for an accommodation, making sure that athletes on girls' teams can wear the clothes that they feel comfortable in and that allow them to perform their sport. Then next we want to consider coach recruitment, retention, and pay. Examine how your payroll and recruitment practices affect coaches. So I suggest doing an analysis of how male coaches and female coaches are recruited, retained, and compensated. This can be very enlightening when you actually look at the data, and the data doesn't lie, right? So if you have fewer female coaches than male coaches, particularly for girls' teams, you want to figure out why. I'm sure many of you have heard the statistic about Title IX, but when Title IX was first passed in 1973, 90% of female sports were coached by women, and now it's something more like, I think it's something like 45% are coached by women. So even though Title IX has passed and has been, a good thing, it has also seemingly led to less opportunities for female coaches, and so we want to kind of analyze how we are perpetuating that or trying to challenge that. And this really applies to leadership too. You want to think about your athletic directors and other people in leadership and analyze this inequity if you've never had a woman or a transgender person in that role. And sometimes these inequities are often created unintentionally, but it requires focused, intentional efforts to undo them. And then next we want to think about promotion and discipline. So similarly, we want to analyze if there's any patterns of disproportionate practices for coaches based on race, gender, sexual orientation, or the type of sport. And sometimes what we find is that female coaches are unfairly disciplined or disciplined more harshly, and that has to do with gender stereotypes, like, for example, thinking that she's screaming at the kids and being abusive, whereas when a male coach does that, it's considered more socially acceptable. We also want to think about, like I talked about earlier, the team's funding, recognition, and facilities, and who's getting what with the boys' teams compared to the girls' teams. We also want to make sure that coaches and athletes are trained, and a lot of this is what our program covers, how to avoid using hurtful language and instead focus on more positive motivational coaching techniques. And then lastly, we really want to analyze the costs associated with playing each sport and making sure that's really accessible to everyone, including low-income families. There's been some research on this and found that when low-income athletes are excluded because of their means to pay, it often more disproportionately affects girls. We want to find ways to make that expensive equipment affordable, for example. We also want to proactively create policies that include transgender athletes and make sure that they are able to be included and play the sport, that they're welcomed onto the team, and that they're comfortable there and can play to their potential. The Tucker Center out of the University of Minnesota is an awesome resource, so I encourage you to Google their resources, and we also have several others, again, attached to our policy document. And then lastly, very quickly, I'll just mention legal requirements to consider. So Title IX, of course, is important for everyone to know about. It is actually required for every school to comply if they receive any kind of federal funding. And this is a federal law that mandates gender equality in K through 12 schools as well as college campuses, and also has protections from sexual assault and sexual harassment. And it requires, for example, a grievance procedure if there are claims of abuse or harassment. So it's important for organizations and schools to be aware of Title IX. And then lastly, mandated reporting. So making sure that folks who work with minors are aware of what their state laws are as well as their internal policies are relating to reporting abuse. Okay. In closing, I would like to thank you all so much for participating today, especially to those of you who have been on all of our webinars. I really appreciate you taking all this time to receive further training about our program Athletes as Leaders. I encourage you to stay in contact, and one way that you can do that is with our contact form on our website, and you can give us your information and then tell us your question or your comment. We love to hear questions, but we also just love to hear little updates on how it's going. I actually heard from someone recently who was implementing in multiple high schools, and we had never even touched base before, so it was just great to hear how it's being received in other communities. And of course, if you have any questions, let me know, or interested in piloting, also let me know. Even if you don't end up piloting, the tools will always be available to you, the evaluation tools as well as the curriculum. It's all free on our website. So with that said, are there any final quick questions that I can answer? Or Jasenia or Lisa, anything that you saw in the chat that you think we should address? Okay. I don't see any questions yet. I see a lot of people saying thank you, and you are very welcome. Thank you. Thank you for all your interest. Thank you for being here, and please stay in touch. And here is my direct contact information, my email, if you do have specific questions. And Jasenia, I'll hand it back to you to close things up.
Thank you all for joining, and if you all are looking for the recording of this webinar, as soon as I close the screen, it'll send you directly to the web page where the recording will be available in the next few hours. Also note that there will be an email that will be sent out to you tomorrow morning that will also have the link to the recording. Thank you all for joining, and have a great rest of your day.